Welcome to Convince Me in 15 Minutes, where we give our guests 15 minutes to convince us about timely topics in the financial services industry. Before we begin, please subscribe below. The Convince Me in 15 Minutes podcast will introduce you to new concepts, theories, philosophies, and practices in the financial services industry. Your guides are Luke Tawas and Keith Thompson. We'll follow up the initial presentation with questions. So again, subscribe below and we'll introduce our guest speaker.
Hi, my name is Brian Gitt. I lead business development for Oklo, which is a company that designs, builds, and operates small nuclear power plants. And I'm here to convince you today that nuclear energy is the best way to generate electricity. All right. So nuclear energy is a 24/7 clean energy resource. And I want to talk about a problem that we're seeing in the United States, but we're actually seeing this in many parts of the world. And that's two big converging forces that are happening. For the first time in about 20 years, we're seeing the load on the power grid increasing dramatically. And at the same time that we're seeing this increased load, we are having all of these companies, be it their data centers or factories or industrial facilities, needing to meet various clean energy goals to reduce their emissions, as well as our own federal government and the military bases that we have across the country. So we have this problem of these two converging forces. And when we talk about this, I want to ground this conversation in specifics, because I think too often we talk about these topics at a 30,000 foot level. So let's drill in and look at one power grid in the United States. This is called PJM. It's basically the area of the country that serves about 65 million people in the mid-Atlantic and Midwest states. This is states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia. And in this area, we're seeing dramatic increase in load growth. We're seeing this mostly from data centers, because Virginia and parts of Ohio are big data center hubs, and you're seeing just a radical increase in the amount of annual load growth in those markets. And then at the same time, we're seeing tough climate policies forcing fossil-fired plants into premature retirement. In fact, just last week, the EPA just issued their final new rule for power plants. And in essence, what this rule is going to have the impact of, in reality, is forcing most of the coal power plants into retirement, or they will have to incorporate carbon capture and storage by 2032. And if they don't do that, they're going to have to shut down by the end of the 2030s. So you're going to have a large amount of coal plants going offline. In fact, 21% of the total installed thermal power plant capacity right now is at risk in this part of the United States. That's a fifth. That's a lot. And all of the new generation assets that are in line waiting to connect to the grid are mostly wind and solar. In fact, it's about 94% of them are, but historically, only about 5% of those actually get connected, and many of them wait for up to 5 years in line just to connect to the grid. So obviously, this is a kind of a slow motion train wreck that's waiting to happen here, because we're going to have higher resource requirements and not enough power generation. And when we look at, well, what are the available solutions to take care of this problem? Well, unfortunately, new transmission lines take a very long time to build. They take about 10 years. And let's be honest, everyone hates transmission lines. No one wants them in their backyard. And the reason this is so hard to build is there's tremendous amount of lawsuits and all these different agencies as you cross state lines and try to get these things built. So it's incredibly difficult. New coal plants, as I just alluded to, are certainly not going to get built, much like many of them are going to get pushed off the grid by 2032 and certainly into the 2030s. By the end of that decade, they're almost all going to be gone based upon this current EPA rule. Wind and solar require the new transmission lines. So even if you had you wanted to deploy all the wind and solar you want, you have to connect it to the grid. And most of the wind and solar resources are usually in outlying areas, not near the urban areas where all the businesses and all the homes are. So there's a big problem there, because that's why even today they're waiting 5 years just to connect to the grid. And unfortunately, wind and solar, although they don't emit any emissions at the point of generation, They don't provide 24/7 power. They're very intermittent. Obviously, in some cases, you can have wind droughts of weeks to months where you don't have any wind. And obviously, you can't power a data center or a factory on that power source when you don't have high reliability. Large nuclear plants are great. We're big fans of those. I think we should build lots of them, but they take a very long time and require a massive amount of upfront capital. The most recent example in Georgia, it took the Vogtle plant, it was 7 years behind schedule and $17 billion over budget. We've just unfortunately lost our ability to build these mega infrastructure projects at scale in the US. In natural gas plants, although they are a clean burning fuel and I think a good solution for reliable, affordable energy, most of the companies that operate the data centers, such as the Amazons, Googles, Microsofts, as well as a lot of the Fortune 500 companies that are buying this power, don't they don't consider natural gas a clean energy resource, and it doesn't help them meet their clean energy goals. So all of these solutions are suboptimal and they're all in their own way. So what does that leave? Well, small nuclear power plants really do provide the best solution, but they have suffered from, historically, nuclear in general has suffered from three big challenges: high upfront costs, long build times, and public perception around safety and waste. Those are kind of the historical challenges. So let's talk about how new small nuclear power plants can overcome those. So when we first talk about the differences between a new nuclear plant and old traditional nuclear, let's kind of ground the conversation in what the traditional assets are. And these are great plants, by the way. We have about 92 operating nuclear power reactors in the United States today. They generate about 19% of our total electricity. However, they take a long time to build. As I mentioned, it's about 7 to 10 years. They take a huge amount of upfront capital, so about $5 billion or more for each 1,000 megawatt unit. So they're very large units. You can't build 100 megawatts or 200 megawatts of this design. You need to build very large plants. They take up their relatively small footprint, but it's still not nothing, right? It's 800 acres per unit. And they typically have to be sited near water because they cool the reactor core with water. So they typically need to be near a lake, a reservoir, a river, the ocean, something like that. And there is a concern about waste, nuclear waste. And these designs don't recycle or can't use recycled fuel. Now, I would argue nuclear waste is not a big challenge or a big problem for example, in 70 years of commercial operation in the United States, again, generating about 20% of our electricity. All of that waste from all those years could fit in one Walmart supercenter. And it's all that fuel can be recycled, but those designs, unfortunately, cannot utilize the recycled fuel. So let's compare that to small nuclear power plants of a particular design. And they're just much simpler. And we know when you have a lot of complexity, you're going to add a lot of cost. And by shrinking the size, lessens the amount of capital at risk. Instead of billions of dollars, of $5 to $10 billion of capital that's required, now you're talking on the order of 100 million on the low end of a pretty small microreactor plant. And because they're a lot smaller, and because you don't have the huge amount of civil works of concrete and steel involved in many of these designs, they can be deployed much faster. So instead of 7 to 10 years, you're looking at around 3 years for these smaller designs. As they navigate the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it has been a long road and a lot of bottlenecks there, but we're kind of near the end of the tunnel on that and see the light. And I think there's a scalable path to getting these approved and out. Different designs have different sizes. I'm going to talk about one particular type of reactor today. And these are built in 15 and 50 megawatt modules. So think of them as Lego blocks. You can just add or subtract or mix or match as many as you want. So you could still build a 500 megawatt deployment. You just put together 10, 50 megawatt modules. And the smallest units, like a 15 megawatt unit, can sit on 2 acres of land. And then every additional Lego block that you add is about 1 acre. So it's a very small footprint. And the 50 megawatt units are even more space efficient. And they don't require water. to cool the reactors. So they use a liquid metal to transfer heat and to cool off the core. And this enables you to site these basically anywhere, right? Not because you don't need to be near a water resource. And then finally, although as I alluded to, I don't think nuclear waste is a huge concern or a big problem, the public does perceive it as an issue. This particular design can burn up and recycle spent fuel. So there's 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel sitting around the country today after those 70 years of commercial operation. There's enough energy still in it. 95% of the energy is in that fuel just sitting there, that you and I, as if you're a US taxpayer, are paying about $1 million a day to have just sit there and do nothing. We could power the United States for about 150 years, just extracting that energy and turning it into new fuel and putting it in small nuclear power plants. So it's an incredible resource we shouldn't waste. So the company that I work for is called Oklo, and we design, build, and operate these small nuclear power plants. And our goal is to overcome those three historical barriers to make it cost efficient, quick to build, and be publicly accepted. And the key to this is the business model. So just as when we think about how business models can completely transform industries, let's think of cloud in AWS. When Amazon Web Services first started offering cloud services, basically compute as a service, that was not done previously, right? And so if you were a company, if you were a financial firm, or you were a Fortune 500 company, you had to invest a bunch of capital to buy a bunch of servers, hire a bunch of people to basically set up those servers, rack them, test them, operate them, eventually decommission them. And you would have that whole investment. And then when AWS came online, they said, well, hey, you don't have to do any of that. Just plug in and you can buy compute as a service and we'll host it for you. Well, Oklo is doing something similar for small nuclear power plants. And this opens up a whole new set of customers, because a data center traditionally would not be interested in buying or operating a power plant traditionally. But now they can just tap in and buy this energy as a service. You can co-locate a small nuclear power plant right next to the data center. So the key to all this, and why I make the claim that small nuclear power plants and nuclear energy in general is the cleanest and safest way to make electricity, is all about energy density. If you imagine a golf ball of uranium metal, that golf ball size of uranium from the time you were born to the time you would die, if you lived an average lifespan, it would provide all of the electricity of your entire life, all of it from birth to death. That's how much is concentrated in one golf ball of uranium metal. It's amazing in terms of its power density. So that's why when we talk about environmental impact, and we talk about things like materials intensity, how much concrete, how much steel, how much all of the various products that go in chemicals and materials that go into making something, what is the materials intensity of that electricity? Nuclear power beats everything, hands down. It's many times more efficient than solar and wind. On the material side, that also translates into land. You just have a very small footprint. You don't need hardly, like as I mentioned, you're talking about a few acres of land. We could, for example, put a 500 megawatt deployment on about 20 acres of land. So 500 megawatts on 20 acres, you would be on thousands of acres of land for solar. So all of those materials and all of that land gets consumed in producing solar power. And even when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, nuclear power has even less life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than solar and wind, and it's just as safe. When we look at all of the data over the last 70 years, including the few accidents that have happened, it is still equivalent in terms of both death rates per terawatt hour produced, as well as from an occupational safety perspective. I would argue it's probably the safest industry in the world. And so for all of those reasons, you can site these things very close within suburban areas. They don't have to be, many, many miles away from your metropolitan areas. They can be right next to the factory or the data center, in providing the essential, abundant, clean energy that we need. So that's why I believe that nuclear energy is not only the safest and the cleanest and the most powerful way to generate electricity, it's just the most affordable and reliable and makes the most sense. So I'll stop there.
All right. Well, this is the part where we ask our audience, did you or did you not convince us? So if you'd all give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, we would greatly appreciate that. Brian, that was fantastic. Just so many questions about the industry in general, perception. It sounds to me like you're in the process of getting these built, but they haven't been built yet. Have there been anything like it built yet? And if so, where?
Sure. So this technology is a proven technology. It's been around a long time. It's actually been around since the 1950s. So there's been about 25 of these types of plants that have been built around the world, about 400 reactor years of operational history. The plant and design that Oklo is most closely commercializing ran for 30 years, from 1964 to 1994. It was a 20 megawatt sodium fast reactor, sodium metal, not to be confused with molten salt. And that reactor had amazing operational characteristics in terms of uptime. It was tested extensively. They ran these catastrophic tests in scenarios to prove the safety case. So, for example, they killed power to the reactor. They locked out all the humans. They even disabled the emergency control rods, which drop in an emergency and stop the fission reaction. They disabled those and they tried to force it to melt down, basically. And all that happens is it cools off on its own. It self-cools and self-regulates using natural forces. So gravity, thermal expansion, things of that nature. So they call this design, not just this one, so the other advanced reactors have similar characteristics in slightly different methods, but they're called walk-away safe, meaning in the worst case natural disaster, tornado, hurricane, flood, fire, whatever you want, if a commercial airliner crashed into it, we're putting these on military bases. So if a missile strike hit it, obviously the powerhouse would be down, but you would not have any human health risk to the surrounding community, zero, because it basically is a small amount of material. It's not a lot to begin with. That's a huge part of it. And it just self-cools and self-regulates. So even if everything gets incapacitated, all the humans, all the power, it'll just cool off on its own.
Brian, could you share with us your personal journey and how you ultimately came to the conclusion that this is ultimately the solution?
Happy to. Yeah, it took me a long time. I was a slow learner. I worked for about 25 years in the energy industry. I spent most of my career working on various technologies that were related to energy efficiency and solar, and just various lighting technologies, wireless power, a whole variety of different projects and programs. We used to run energy efficiency programs for utilities in California. And ultimately, I learned a lot over that time. I learned, unfortunately, that a lot of those technologies are although like energy efficiency is great, obviously, we should be as efficient as we can. It's not ultimately going to solve our problems. We need to have a highly concentrated form of energy that we can generate to push human progress forward, to be able to run these data centers and ultimately progress as a human species. So over my course of my career, I just realized a lot of these things weren't scaling in the way that I had hoped, and they weren't really going to solve the problem. I mean, solar is great. I don't have any problem. I'm agnostic on technology, honestly. What led me to nuclear is that I just felt it was the best way to generate electricity. It's just from an environmental lens, for all the reasons I just shared. It's the smallest environmental footprint. It has the highest concentration of energy, and it can truly fuel the type of technologies and advancements that we need as a society to get better.
So we've had several guests on talking about energy and energy generation. One of the issues that's come up is the paucity of uranium available. You talked about being able to reuse some of this waste from other facilities as a source of fuel for some of these projects you're talking about. Does that help solve some of that problem, or is this still a problem even for these smaller generators?
Yeah, I think, in the short term, we do have some bottlenecks on the enrichment side, but that's not due to lack of resource. There's tremendous amount of resource available. And as I mentioned, there's enough just in the United States. There's 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel just sitting there doing nothing that we should be harnessing. It's an incredible resource. I consider it a gift, not a waste product. I mean, if 95% of that energy is still in it, and we can power the U.S. for the next 150 years just on that, that's the potential of it. So we don't have scarcity of a resource, and that's just the recycled fuel. We have abundant uranium around the world. It's not really a constrained resource at this point. Where the bottlenecks are political, right? Right now, what's happening right now with Russia, obviously, and they have a lot of the enrichment capacity. So we're trying to reshore a lot of that. So that we do have challenges. There's no doubt about it in the short term, but it's not due to lack of resource. It's more the enrichment capacity or the politics of where we need to source it. So I think that's a very solvable problem. And using the combination of using spent fuel, recycled fuel, raw material. I mean, it's inexhaustible for all practical purposes. It's inexhaustible. We're talking about by the time that the sun would blow up in how many billions of years from now, we have plenty of available energy from nuclear to power the world from now until then. So I'm not really concerned about kind of scarcity in the long term, although we will have bottlenecks and bumps in the road due to all our human intervention in the process.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned data centers earlier. I believe I was reading that Microsoft and ChatGPT, $100 billion facility, they were looking at nuclear as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's all publicly available now, but most of all the big cloud providers and hyperscale co-location companies, they're all looking at this. I mean, Amazon recently just purchased Cumulus Data, which is an asset that was sitting next to Susquehanna nuclear power plant. Basically, they're going to build a 960 megawatt data center campus next to the nuclear power plant, and they basically sourced all that nuclear power for the powering that Amazon data center. Microsoft, as you mentioned, also has executed power purchase agreements with Constellation, which is a very large utility that operates a bunch of nuclear power plants. All of the cloud providers have huge challenges with how they're going to meet just the basic electricity needs and to make sure it's clean. So they're trying to take down any and all capacity they can find, whether it's renewables or nuclear. It doesn't really matter as long as it doesn't have emissions.
So you talked about the NIMBY problem with power lines. I've got to imagine that's tenfold, though, with nuclear. How do you get past that perception of nobody wants a nuclear plant in their backyard?
Well, it's important to do early education and stakeholder engagement and be transparent and honest with people up front, because from my perspective, we don't have anything to hide. This is a great story. You have a plant that basically has no safety risk to the community, right? It can't melt down. It's basically a plant that has zero emissions. There's no air emission. There's no CO2 emissions. There's no water affluent runoff from the plant whatsoever. So from an environmental standpoint, it has only positive benefits for the community. It's adding tremendous energy resilience and reliability. It's not competing with local community power. It has zero emissions. It's walk-away safe. So there's the emergency planning zone for some of these small nuclear power plants is the site itself. They don't even have buffer zones or setbacks. So you can put these things in master plan communities. You can put them in areas where houses are not too far away. So there's no health risk to the community. And then if the waste concern, if you're recycling the waste, those are really the two things the public cares about. What are you going to do about the waste? And what happens if there is an accident? I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but those are really the two things that most of the people care about. Well, if you're solving a waste problem because you're recycling it, and you can recycle that many times through, not just once through, many times through, you can keep recycling it for decades. And you can't actually have just the physics of it using gravity and thermal expansion. You can't actually have the accidents that people imagine. Once you get people in a room and you explain how it works and what the actual externalities are, which are basically just clean power, a lot of those disappear pretty quick. Now, of course, you're always going to have some not in my backyard people. You could put a school next to them and they're going to not want it in their backyard, right? I mean, there's lots of people, some people don't want anything built. So you're always going to have to deal with that, right? And you're going to have to educate people. But I think the story is incredibly powerful and incredibly positive. So I think it's very overcomable in terms of public perception.
You talked about that one plant that had a 65-year life cycle from, I think, the mid 60s to the early 90s. Where was that physically?
That was at Idaho National Lab. So it was a US government lab. It was a 20 megawatt sodium fast reactor. They ran all kinds of tests on it, but also it provided power to the grid at different points in time as well. So it was running for 30 years. So it was in Idaho.
And why was that ultimately shut down? Why is that still not operational?
It was mostly just politics at the time. Natural gas was really cheap. There really wasn't a lot of pressure to reduce emissions. This was, basically in the 90s. If you remember that time, climate wasn't a big concern, so there wasn't a lot of policy pushing for reducing CO2 emissions, for example. Natural gas was really cheap. The U.S. has abundant energy resources. Load growth was flat, so utilities weren't investing in new technologies at the time. They weren't envisioning that all of a sudden you're going to have this huge load growth. So if you're a utility and you make your money off of investing in new infrastructure, et cetera, your load growth is flat, you have cheap natural gas, there's no policy pushing you to reduce your emissions necessarily. Why would you embrace a new technology and take on new risk? You would just do the standard status quo.
Can we go back to what you were saying earlier in regards to there's been wind built, but it's not being connected to the grid? I mean, that kind of blows me away. That's like saying I'm building, a whole bunch of houses, but there's no water or waste, available to connect to those houses. I mean, why not do it the other way around? That once the power line is built, then you build the wind or solar.
Well, so wind and solar, it depends on the market you're talking about. I was giving an example in PJM in that it's one of the largest power grids, and they are waiting up to 5 years to connect. It's just the process, to finance those projects, to get them built. They're assuming that the power lines eventually are going to be able to get there and they'll be grid connected. So I can't speak for those developers in terms of what their criteria is and when they decide to build or not build. And I'm sure it's a variety of reasons, but the line is long to connect right now, and it's just incredibly difficult to build out new transmission capacity.
Well, I've got to imagine that all of this is intertwined with politics. It's intertwined with regulations. Look, our government has had notorious for building bridges to nowhere and building grids that can't connect to wind farms or the other way around. How do you get past that? Is it lobbying? Is it going out to the public at large and trying to educate them via forums like this even?
I think it's a combination of things that are necessary. Certainly, this is a political and policy matter at the top of this problem. And there is, I think, bipartisan support right now to build infrastructure. I mean, I think on the Democratic side, there's a strong impetus to connect all these solar and wind projects, and even more support for nuclear power recently because they're wanting to reduce emissions. And they realize that if you don't build out this infrastructure, you're not going to hit those goals, right? So there's strong support from Democrats for that, and from Republicans. Having reliable electricity, energy security, all of those kind of more conservative traditional values are embedded in, us building out infrastructure to have secure, reliable, affordable energy. So this is one of the few issues that is bipartisan. That doesn't make it easy to get it passed, obviously, and the devil's always in the details. But I think we are going to see, this is just layers and layers of rules and regulations that have built up over time and have now gotten to a point where it's so difficult. But you can't just choose one thing, right? You can't. It's not a simple fix. So it's going to take time to unravel some of this. And there's a lot of people working on it in DC right now.
So if somebody wanted to learn more on the subject of nuclear power, what resources are out there for people to learn more?
Recently there's a tremendous number of resources. There's a great website that is whatisnuclear.com is great. It's a guy that's an engineer that's worked in the industry forever and just is a fun side project to put this together. But there's tremendous information on there, and it's all very technically sound and accurate, and that's a good resource. But honestly, if people Google nuclear energy today, they're going to get so many resources they probably don't know what to do with it. There's so much out there at this point.
Speaking of resources, if I'm not mistaken, you've written a book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I wrote a book called In the Dark, Fixing Energy Policies That Hurt People and the Planet. And I wrote it partially due to my own journey, my personal journey of kind of having these false beliefs that wind and solar and efficiency was going to solve all of our problems and fix kind of our environmental impact. And it kind of charts the path of my own journey and then what I'm seeing today from a policy perspective out in the US. It's using the US as a lens, but a lot of these things apply internationally in terms of what are the evaluation criteria? What are the principles that we should be considering when we're making these investment decisions and policy decisions? So whether you're an investor or a policymaker or a corporate leader, what are the core criteria that we should be considering? Because there's always trade-offs. There's no perfect solution. We all know that. I mean, there's no silver bullet here. So we have to have evaluation criteria to be able to inform our decision-making process, because we're investing trillions of dollars into technologies that I think are a complete malinvestment. I mean, I've never seen a greater waste of resources and time in what we're doing right now, pursuing kind of arbitrary goals and focusing on the wrong tech. And it's really a shame because we have such better solutions available.
You mentioned the Northeast as kind of being an area of huge kind of demand growth for power. What is the likelihood, and what do you think is the timetable for getting one of these built in an area like the Northeast, where I think it would probably be very difficult to get things done?
For Oklo, our first plant will be built by end of 2027, and we have additional projects that will be going through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission shortly thereafter, that we hope coming out in 2029, soon thereafter that. So, I think we're talking about late 2020s is we're going to start seeing these deployments happen.
And will most of those be for things like data centers, or will that be for general public consumption?
Most of these will be for specific large energy customers. So be it a data center, a factory, a military base, those kinds of applications, not necessarily utilities.
And the nuclear industry worldwide is growing, right? I mean, you're talking about India, China. I mean, aren't those countries building over 100 plants? I mean, it's just here in the United States, we've only built one maybe in the last 20 years. Isn't that right?
That's correct. We're seeing a huge resurgence in interest in nuclear energy globally. We're seeing there's at the most recent climate conference, I forgot the exact number of countries, but a couple dozen or more countries committing to triple the amount of nuclear power that they want to generate by 2050. And you're seeing this throughout a resurgence of this throughout Eastern Europe, and as well as in the UK and France. You're seeing this in the Middle East. You're seeing this throughout, obviously, India and China and other parts of Asia. So there's a huge recognition that the only way we're truly going to be able to scale our energy use and development, at the same time reduce emissions, nuclear power is going to have to play a really big part of that ultimately.
And when you look at uranium prices, aren't they up dramatically from where they were 4 or 5 years ago? And how does that impact the cost associated with producing electricity?
Well, it depends. The cost, it depends on the type of technology and the size of the plant. For the large plants, the cost of fuel is relatively minor. I mean, in France, for example, I think it's 5 to 10% of their costs to run a nuclear power plant is the fuel. So it's not an outsized cost center. For smaller plants, it's actually the inverse. So fuel costs are considerable. Like they can be close to 50%, depending on the design and the size, but they can be significant. So you can't just broad brush it. It depends on the technology. But I think for most of these large projects, it's not a huge contributing factor to the cost.
Well, there's a flip side to that. If the costs are much greater for some of these smaller plants like you're describing, with uranium prices rising, does that curtail the growth in that side of the business?
I don't think so, because as I was going through before, there aren't a lot of good options. There's power when you have a scarcity in a market and you have a coveted resource, which is this 24/7 firm clean power. There's not a whole lot of other options. So it might get a price premium in the market because of that power scarcity and some of the clean attributes of the power source. So I don't think it's going to constrain it. And ultimately, once we get recycling infrastructure up and line, you can cut your fuel costs by 80%. So there's a path to actually reducing those costs over time after this infrastructure is built out. It's going to take some time, obviously, to do that. It's not going to happen next year or the year after, but there's a path to reducing those costs.
Well, any final comments that you'd like to make in terms of supporting your thesis and convincing our listeners?
Well, I would just say if people are interested in learning more about kind of any of the things I was talking about today, one, they could read the book. I even provide it for free. I don't make any money on the book. I wrote it just to share information and knowledge. You can go to my personal website, briangitt.com. You can actually read it for free electronically, or you can get a paper copy shipped to you for like $9, including shipping. Again, we don't make any money on it. It's just the cost of printing and shipping it. So I would say the best place to find that information is on my website, or follow me on Twitter, or formerly Twitter, now X, at Brian Gitt. I try to share as much knowledge and information and trends and news that I'm tracking, which I spend all day, every day, reading, digesting the stuff, trying to curate it and share what I'm learning. So those would be the best places to follow up if you want to learn more.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Brian. I certainly learned a lot, and I know our listeners will too. Keith, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I just want to say, look, all of this has been incredibly educational for me. It gives me at least hope for the fact that as consumers, we're going to have a reliable and inexpensive source of energy moving forward. But I think the cleanliness is a big deal, and I think getting past that for most consumers is a big deal. So thanks for helping educate us on that topic.
Thanks for inviting me. It was fun.